Hi, everyone. Rohan, should we pull up the first slide? Yes. Hi, so we'll just wait for a couple minutes for people to join and then just start in exactly 3 minutes. Hi, for those of you who've just joined, we'll be starting shortly. Okay, I think we have a good enough number to start. So hello, good morning and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Mansi and I'm the engagement lead for civil society organizations at WBA and also been overlooking the consultations for ITA with stakeholders the last couple of months. Talking of the last couple of months, in fact, it's been a very pivotal time for us at WBA. We've evolved our thinking with the changing world and adopted yet another acronym in our parlance, that is the ITA. To quickly recap, we launched the draft methodology of the Integrated Transition Assessment Framework on 22nd April. And since then, it has been officially open for consultation. We've engaged with companies, investors, governments, civil society organizations, and even technical experts across the world. And not just to hear what is working, but to also understand where the gaps are and what we might be missing. And I say this on behalf of the entire team that we've been genuinely humbled by how generous everyone has been with their time and knowledge. And if I may share, we've had people spend an entire hour on just a single indicator, and that depth and the fact that a lot of it was voluntary has been, for me at least, one of the most energizing parts of the process. So just want to start with saying thank you. Um, Today is one of those last conversations before we move from consultation into finalization. So this is slightly unusual kind of a session. We'll try not to talk too much or ask you to weigh in on a blank canvas, but share what we've learned so far, where the harder questions still sit, and utilize this safe space to listen to each other and move forward together. I can see from the list that we have organizations on the call who our team has already consulted and then some new ones. So if you haven't had a chance yet to engage or simply want a last moment to test ideas with our team before we close this chapter, please do. With that, I'll hand over to Alejandro now for a quick recap of what we're proposing and the feedback we've received so far. Thank you.
Thank you, Mansi. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our session. And again, want to reiterate Mansi's words of thanks for everybody to taking the time to help us think through our new methodology and contributing so many good ideas. We can move to the next slide, please, Rohan. What I'll do is just very briefly, what we're trying to do today is to give you a recap of the proposal for our new methodology. I'll go through a little bit of detail on what that looks like. I want to also share very briefly the highlights of the feedback that we've gotten until now, and then give you a sense of next steps. And then hopefully we can go into a bit of an open session in case there's questions, comments, further feedback. We're always happy to receive more, even if we can't always address every single thing that we get. Let's dive into a new methodology, please, Rohan. What does this look like? You can go to the next step. And the first thing is to remind you why we're developing a new methodology. If you happen to know the World Benchmarking Alliance, and even if you don't, we used to have a set of 7 system benchmarks that used to cover both different sectors like food, digital, urban, and also different topics like social, climate, and nature. And we're changing that and we're moving to an integrated assessment. So why are we moving to an integrated assessment? First, because there's a recognition that the world doesn't operate in these isolated bits, but rather that those risks that relate to people and to planet, to nature, to climate, to rights, to jobs, all of that is interrelated and it all needs to come together in a more visible way. Those risks, particularly around climate change, about nature degradation, and social inequalities, these risks are compounding. They change how companies operate, they interact with each other. We now have also AI as a sort of disruptor of the whole system, with environmental, with social implications. So all of these things need to be seen and understood in relationship to each other and as a whole set of systemic changes. That's kind of like the big picture reason why we are moving to something that tries to capture all of that in one place. The other is that we need to just accept that the sustainability agenda is suffering from a difficult moment with political support and financial support for in the environment and social issues uh, um, narrowing and creating less space for action. So we need to, it prompts a reflection about how ambitious that agenda needs to be. And to us, that means also a reflection on what actually is the stuff that we really cannot let companies off the hook on. So what is the real core things that companies need to still be accountable? It doesn't matter if there's a retreat, it doesn't matter if the scope is narrowing. What are the things that are really matter that we need to take into account to make companies to hold companies to account? That also is related to the next observation, which is there's a lot of promises, a lot of commitments, a lot of statements, a lot of strategy. But over the years, benchmarking companies, we've seen very little progress on moving from commitment to delivery. And we think that that can no longer be the case. So we need to be able to say something substantive about how companies are delivering on those promises. And then finally, and maybe to reiterate the first point about integration, in companies themselves, these issues of climate, nature, and people are treated separately, often in different departments, often by completely different teams that are not talking to each other. And we feel that this is part of the problem, that there is no sense of a view from many of the companies about all their different impacts in their complete way. So these are the reasons why we are moving to an integrated methodology. which I will now explain in a few slides. Rohan. This is again to recap for those who've heard this before, but these are the principles that have guided the development of our methodology. I want to spend a minute here because it's really important to emphasize the general framing of our changes. The first is kind of obvious, but the methodology needs to help us do our mission, which is to hold companies to account. So it needs to have an impact orientation. The second principle, which is one of the biggest changes, or really drives one of the biggest changes, is that our methodology needs to be universally applicable to all the companies that we assess. So we cannot pick and choose the framework or the companies based on different parts of the framework. All of the framework and all of the methodology applies to all the companies across all industries. At the same time, we need to be able to have enough sectoral specificity when it's needed. And I can get into that in just a moment, but this is really important. While the framework is applicable to all the companies, not all the companies will be judged equally, and we will have some differences across sectors depending on what companies or what sectors the companies are. Our framework needs to be aligned with global standards. We don't need to create extra work for companies. We don't want to increase the reporting burden. We will align ourselves as much as possible with existing frameworks, existing standards, and obviously, as usual, grounded in the scientific consensus. We want in a new framework or methodology to be simple. We want it to be fairly easy to understand, intuitive. Everything in there should make sense to companies, to CSOs, to banks. Everybody should be able to understand this at a very basic level. We also want to have some comparability with our previous benchmarks. And so even though what I'll present now shows like a bit like a sort of whole toss up and change, at the level of specific indicators, there's quite a bit of continuity. So you'll be able to track indicators from our previous benchmarks to our new methodology. And finally, integration is a big part, as I have said, where we bring climate, nature, and social as bits that come together as a whole, both in the scoring criteria of specific indicators, but also in the overall scoring. Rohan, next one. What is this framework? And Mansi was telling me before we started that I say sometimes framework and sometimes I methodology and sometimes I say assessment. What is the difference between all these things? I kind of use them interchangeably. Methodology is the thing we apply to assess companies on their social nature and environmental performance. And the framework is, in my mind, how all the indicators come together, how we group things or how we cluster things within that methodology. But it's not like they're not sufficiently different. So I'm going to tell you the framework. So the framework means how does everything come together in the methodology. There's two organizing principles to our methodology. One is what we call measurement areas, meaning the way we group indicators thematically. And here the measurement areas try to capture the trajectory that companies should follow from strategy and ideas to action. So we have now suggested three measurement areas, one called planning, the other called implementation, and the other called performance. In planning, we check, does the company have a credible plan? Does it have the commitments, the ambitions, the targets, the governance, the roadmaps to get it to a more sustainable future? Then we look at implementation. Does the company have the systems that it needs in place to deliver on these plans? Does it have the monitoring systems? Does it have the procedures? Does it engage with stakeholders? Does it allocate resources? Does it do all this stuff in the day-to-day that is needed to implement these plans. And then finally, performance, which in a way is the most important thing, which is what are the observable outcomes of all this stuff the company is saying? What are the impacts? Can we measure them? Can we track them through time? So this is how we group the indicators, let's say, like I said, thematically. The other organizing principle is the what we call here dimensions, which is a separate view on climate, nature, and social. And while we and I have talked about integration, it is also the case that reporting frameworks, advocacy, policy is often divided across these broad dimensions of climate, nature, and social. So under climate, obviously, we look at how the company is doing in its process towards decarbonization, if it's actually reducing its greenhouse gas emissions. Under nature, we look at how the company is reducing its nature impacts. And under social, we bring together a bunch of different things, including human rights, decent work, just transition, and we are adding AI as a sort of new cross-cutting dimension under the, not dimension, sorry, I'm now using the words that I shouldn't be, that I tell people not to use, um, as a cross-cutting issue that affects the social dimension. So next slide, please. That those two structuring principles then result in this 3x3 framework, where you have in the rows climate, nature, and social, and in the columns planning, implementation, and performance. And I won't go into the details as to what is in each of those boxes, but then obviously what planning looks like for climate will be slightly different than what it looks for nature and for social. So for example, to take planning under climate, there's a very clear set of expectations around companies on their greenhouse gas emissions reductions. They need to be aligned with the Paris Agreement. There's very already sector-specific pathways that are expected to be followed by different companies. So there's a very mature, actually, issue around climate and what is expected of companies in terms of their transition planning. Nature on planning is similarly framed by an international convention, obviously the Convention on Biological Diversity. So there are a lot of expectations already about what the company should be doing, the targets it should be setting. We have the target or the goal as a society to reduce nature impacts and restore nature by 2030. So that trickles down to the level of companies, and it should be implemented, or it should be elaborated in a transition plan. And then social is a bit different, obviously, because we don't have anything like a universally acknowledged social plan or social transition plan. This is a mix of expectations we have with companies around, for example, human rights, about decent jobs. Increasingly, we think responsible AI is going to be part of this. Wages, gender, so there's a lot of expectations that are contained, or a mix of expectations that are contained under the planning in social. And for each of these categories, which I won't go into, you will have the nature, climate, and social specificities. Now, we've talked about integration, and our framework is referred to as an integrated assessment framework. So how do we integrate? So there's a few different ways in which we integrate. One is first, and as I'll mention in a moment, we will have a score that captures basically all of these 3x3 in kind of one collapsed way. And I'll show you that in a second, it'll become a bit clear. Second, we have indicators interspread across the methodology that look at integration. The most obvious one is just transition, which is now located under the social dimension. and it has to do with the upskilling and reskilling, for example, of jobs as a response to a climate transition. So it's looking across to climate to check what the company is doing in its decarbonization plan, and then looking at the impacts on its workforce. So that's immediately crossing over from one to the other. And then we also have indicators that really cross or cut across, for example, board accountability, board expertise. These things, the board needs to have accountability across climate, across nature, and across social. These things cannot be separated. The next slide, Rohan, thank you, shows you what this scoring might look like. And just ignore for a second the little traffic lights because that's just for illustration. But our proposal until now, and we have, I think this is one of the things that we have received most questions about. I think people are really interested in this and really want to know. And I'm just presenting our initial idea. Until now, we've used mostly a numerical rank for a company assessment. So a given company, whatever, would have a number associated with its performance in the social benchmark, in the food benchmark. It would be like 50 out of 100 or 40 out of 100 or 80 out of 100. We are moving to something that is a bit different and that communicates where the company is in a more narrative or qualitative ladder or steps. We're currently using this in our ACT core methodology, where what we do is we don't give the company a number, but we give the company a letter score that represent where we think they are on their transition journey, let's say. So for example, here this would apply across measurement areas. So on, for example, planning on climate, we have a set of criteria that can tell us whether on that issue the company is, for example, basic, middle, advanced, next practice. How do we know if it's middle, basic, advanced? So we have a very clear set of expectations around what a company should like minimally be doing to have a good climate plan, what it looks like, or what issues it should include to have much better or a more credible climate plan, and then what would it look like if we had like a really good climate plan. So all of these things are under construction, but just to tell you that for each of those 9 boxes, then there is a clear narrative about what it means, for example, to a company, for a company to be implementing on nature across these different categories. Now, our initial proposal, and this might change, but our initial proposal is that then for each of climate, nature, and social, there is some sort of letter grade or summary score that gives you a sense of where the company is on climate. And then we provide an overall score reading vertically across this that gives you like a unified sense. Now, I've used a little traffic lights here to illustrate what this might look like. So for example, this is the scorecard of a company. So you immediately know that it's doing well in planning on nature and social, but maybe performance on climate and nature is not very good. So this immediately kind of gives you a sense of where the areas where the company needs to work harder. Now, will it be letters or will it be colors? I think this is something that we're still working out, but this is the general orientation of the methodology, where you can see in one place where things are going better and where things need more work. Happy to take questions and suggestions about this at the end, by the way. I'm finishing now. Moving to the next slide, which is a really important slide because everything until now is just, as I call it, the framework, meaning how all of these things come together. But the real where the rubber hits the road in our methodology is specific indicators. And I want to stress that the most informative and the more meaningful aspect of our methodology is at the level of indicators. This is where you know whether the companies are meeting the expectations or not. So our framework is sector agnostic, meaning that all the indicators are applicable to all companies. We used to have famously, back in our benchmarks, it was a question from a company we had where we were assessing a freight company on their soil health indicators. So there were all sorts of mismatches between what the company was doing in the real world and how we were assessing. So we are moving to all the indicators need to be applicable to all companies in all sectors. Now, how each company is assessed on a specific indicator does vary sector by sector and depending on where they are in the value chain. Okay, and so this is considered. We already do this in the climate methodologies. And so my example comes from the climate methodology, which is, I think, that maybe the clearest, which is, for example, when we look at the emissions performance of a company under the climate methodology, the indicator is called climate performance or emissions performance. It's the same indicator for all companies. When we're assessing it, we actually have a database of sectors and sectoral pathways that tell us what the curve of decarbonization needs to be for a company in that sector. So oil and gas is different, utilities is different, automotive, heavy industries, food and agriculture. There's all sorts of nuances. And so when we look at the performance of a company in emissions performance, we adjust it to that curve for decarbonization for that specific sector. This principle now will be applied to all the indicators, and it will be tricky, and it will be possibly messy, but this is the principle that companies need to be assessed on what is relevant to them. Now, what we're going to do is for every indicator, we will cross-reference that indicator with what is expected internationally on international standards. For example, GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative. And we will, so for example, we are assessing the nature impact indicator on a, say, apparel company. So we will check with the standard what is the expected material topic for that company in that sector. And so, for example, it might be air pollution or water withdrawals or water pollution. And then the company will be assessed on that issue. A company in a different sector might not have anything to do or might not be the most material on, say, water use, but it might be land use, for example. So that is what it will be assessed on. I have this example here in the little box where it shows you how we might approach the indicator of impact drivers. Like I said, you look at the impact driver that is material for that sector, and then we also consider where in the value chain is that impact greatest, upstream in its operations or downstream. Now, I tried to pack into this slide what is essentially 80% of our work right now, which is getting this right. So if you have lots of questions about this, that's okay. I'm happy to try to answer them a bit later. But it's really important that just to clarify that the greatest effort that we're putting right now is to get that sector matching with the indicators in the best possible way, where the expectations of a company for a particular issue are matched to what is expected for the sector. Happy to get into that in the question and answer. And then wrapping up this bit, Rohan, just to tell you what we have received on feedback until now. You can put the next slide. So we've had a bunch of sources of feedback. We had a survey, which you can see here how the stakeholders were divided. Roughly half of the respondents were companies. We've also had one-to-one consultations. Also, about half of them with companies. We've had webinars, we've had roundtables, we have discussions. We had a bunch of really good feedback, some super detailed, some top line. All of it has been processed, all of it has been looked at. Nothing has been kind of overlooked. And the next slide shows you the headline of the headlines of the feedback, which really boil down to we have generally there's lots of support for the approach, but people have lots of questions, let's say, and want more details. We've had good alignment with WBA's mission. People like this sector-specific approach, but they really want to understand how it's going to work. Some companies particularly have complained that some of the topics don't feel mature enough. And so that's also down to us to understand uh, um, how to make it a bit more clear. And as you might imagine, stuff that NGOs feel really like excited about, the companies like maybe don't feel so excited about. So, but that's the world. This latter approach to scoring that I was telling you, I think we've had a bit mixed reviews in that people like the idea that it tells a story about progression, but companies really like their numbers and their rankings. So we need to find a way to compensate those things. Some people have mourned, oh, why don't you have the food benchmark? What happened to the digital benchmark? But I think people are coming to understand that we still assess food companies, we're still assessing digital companies. They're just being looked at in a different way, and we are preserving enough comparability at the level of indicators uh, to try to read across from our previous work. Predictably, people, everybody has their main pet thing that they care about, and so that's always, why are you looking at this? Why aren't you looking at that? That said, there's some really chunky ones that really have prompted us to look much more clearly to how we deal with things like adaptation and resilience, gender, which is there but not super explicit, supply chain, which is also there but maybe not super explicit, and things around circular economy. So I think these are the main bits that people feel need a bit more. And generally, people, like the idea that we build on other frameworks, but they really plead with us that please don't create new requirements for us. Please don't increase the reporting burden. I think we're taking every step to make sure that everything we do is aligned with what is there externally. The next, and I think final slide, will take you to the next steps, just to walk you through. We've been doing during the last couple of months the consultations. We're over the next 3 months or so doing that very difficult job of the work at the indicator level that I was telling you about. And that includes taking all this feedback on board, finalizing the scoring guidelines, planning our campaign externally. Hopefully this will all be done by around COP in November, when we'll have our final methodology published. We'll have a publication, we'll have more webinars to explain this in detail, and then hopefully we will be starting to assess companies in this methodology. And I think that the last thing I'd say is, and Mansi, maybe you'll reiterate, this is to us, it feels, we've put a lot of work developing this, but really it's the beginning of the process of this needs to make sense, this needs to be useful, this needs to deliver something that is uh, um, of use to you and to the external world. So it really is for us the beginning, or signals the beginning of a very long journey of getting this stuff used. I think I'm done, Mansi, and I'll pass it back to you. Sorry for this kind of longish monologue, but hopefully that was enough detail. Thank you.
This was really useful. And as you've been presenting, Alejandro, the chat has been live with questions already. And I think we can, Rohan, also move to the next slide, which proposes some questions, yeah, from our side. So Alejandro, I've already addressed two questions. One was on the cadence of the assessment and another on just the timeline of publication. But we have quite a few on company sector mapping, materiality, some questions at the indicator level. So I'm happy to read it out, but also just to say, Claudia, if you'd like to unmute yourself or add more nuance to the questions you've asked, please feel free to. Otherwise, I'm happy to read out the questions.
Hello, everyone. Sure. So my question is around the sectors specific selection. So, for example, if you are a global company and you have several divisions who have a completely different business and you cover several sectors and value chains. So my question was around, okay, how is this considered and how are these, let's say, individual approaches of these divisions according to their greatest impact, considered in your methodology? Because this is super important for us that we can show what we do and that we have the space to do this in this kind of methodology.
Thank you, Claudia. That's a very good question. It has come up before, and I think the short answer to that is we're working on it. The slightly longer answer to that is we have a few different options, and one is which is I think what we've been doing in the past, because obviously this has come up back in the past. We use primary sector or primary economic activity, secondary economic activity. So we also have our own system of classifying these diversified companies into their primary, secondary, and either tertiary economy activity. So we have a way to address or to assess the companies on the bit of the company that we think is the most important one. So you will be assessed on that one and possibly on the second one. So this is one approach that is being considered and that my colleagues in the let's say the part of the team that works on the sectors and the company list is defining until now. So will be very happy to share more of that later, but this is it's a very good point. We are very conscious of that, and we want to do something that fits the reality of these companies in the best way. It will not be perfect because we cannot cover all the possible things that a diversified company does, but we do our best effort to capture its primary or secondary or tertiary activity.
Thank you. And maybe I can also follow up with the second question that I had on materiality, because we have seen that according to our regulatory requirements, we have, of course, done a double materiality analysis, and this defines your reporting. And if you, for example, deviate in your communication from this reporting, it's a bit weird because it triggers questions from these auditors who assure our sustainability reporting. And this is why I'm asking, okay, how do you do that? How do you define the materiality based also on which frameworks, and how does it match then with the reporting of these companies, right?
Yeah. That's very, very sensible, Claudia, as well. I would say, so we try to align, and this is work in progress as well, but we are trying to align, as we did in our previous benchmarks, on existing reporting standards and so we have used, for example, SASB, if I'm not mistaken, we've used GRI, UNFPI. There's a bunch of standards that we refer to when we look at things like materiality. And our previous nature benchmark considered double materiality quite explicitly. So my sense is there will probably be quite a good alignment with what you're already doing, because we're just using what are common reporting frameworks already and common standards. We're not going to make up something new. What we are trying to do, and maybe this is where some adjustment will be needed, is we will have to define for a particular company what are its most material topics, and so where will we be expecting the companies to be reporting on. So if we think that the company in that sector, some of its most material impacts are, say, on water withdrawals, And that is what the standard, like the international standard, kind of suggests. We would be expecting to the reporting to match that. Now, there might be a very good reason why a company does not report on water withdrawals, for example, even though that is the expectation. So we would be then going into the context to understand why the mismatch. But that our general entry point will be the expectation from the standards and checking against the company reporting. And I need to give time for other questions as well. So I will stop there, Claudia, but we will, and if you want, my email is somewhere there. Happy to have a further discussion on this, and when as we refine our methodology on this, I'd be very happy to share more details.
Perfect, thank you.
Thanks, Claudia. I'd like to invite Veronique to ask their question. I see a couple of questions from Veronique.
Yes, I have asked a couple of questions, but you answer most of them. So let me check. Yes, maybe the last one I have asked is based on the feedback that you received from your stakeholder. What are the topics you are going to move forward, and what is the time frame associated to those actions?
As in, what topics you mean? Sorry, what do you mean by topics?
I mean, are you going to evolve some part of the methodologies, or what do you take into account actually?
Right. Yeah, so I don't think it's gonna change dramatically because we have not received anything in the feedback that is like, this is totally off, and this is not what we received is, I would say, maybe incremental or refinement suggestions. Say, for example, on the issue of adaptation, which we thought we had covered in a couple of places, but people are really wondering like where they don't see it. So this has been that it's not like suddenly we're like gonna do adaptation because it has always been there, but it's obvious that it's not clear enough the way we have talked about it. And so I don't think there's anything that we're considering all the feedback. I don't think we're adding anything new to the methodology, but the feedback has helped us clarify and refine many things, and this will happen over the next 2 or 3 months when we develop the scoring guidelines.
Okay.
Thanks, Veronique. Okay, just in interest of time, I think I'm going to move to the next question. So there's a question, Alejandro, from Francesca on the comparability of the new framework with previous year's assessments, and she's wondering if the list of indicators included in the current draft are majorly different from the ones before.
Yeah, great question. They are some are exactly the same. Some have been transferred exactly the same. Others have been tweaked, and others are different. And so the comparability will be a bit mixed. We are trying the best as we can to bring indicators as kind of closely as we can to previous indicators. For example, I think all the like core human rights indicators, which WBA has been tracking for years and years, all of that is going to come, I think, almost straight into a new methodology. So we have that transversal or horizontal comparability. Climate, obviously, we're using the same as the last time. There's some indicators, and nature are the ones that I'm thinking about more. We used to have separate, like we had like a water indicator, an air pollution indicator, a plastics indicator, a land use indicator. That will now all be a bit collapsed under a nature impacts indicator. And like I said, if plastics are material for that sector, then we'll look at plastics. If water is material, we'll look at water, but we won't have a standalone plastic and water and etc. indicators. So that will require, I think will still be comparable, but it will require for you to dig sort of below the indicator level to understand how companies are doing. But comparability is really important, and we try to preserve as much as we can.
Thanks, Francesca. Hopefully that answers your question. Otherwise, like Alejandro said, feel free to email us. I'll move to the next question by Christine.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Alejandro, the next question is about the just transition indicator and whether it's limited to the climate dimension. So Christine is asking, what if a company in the service sector may not be very carbon intensive, but may need, let's say, a just AI transition?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. I think you're right. The transition might not always be related to decarbonization, and we are explicitly looking at the impacts of AI on the workforce. And so I think the upskilling, reskilling bit of the assessment will kind of be a bit agnostic in terms of where it's coming from and what is driving it. In some cases, it will be very related to, for example, sector by sector. If you have in the utility sector or in the heavy industry sector that used to be very carbon heavy, then you might need to switch the workforce to, like, say, greener technologies. But in other sectors that are, like, as you say, service oriented, then the transition might be more driven by automatization, AI, etc. And so that's what we'll be looking at. So both will be considered.
Perfect. And I just scrolled down to see there's another suggestion from Christine that I think is best if it comes from her. So Christine, if you want to unmute yourself, because I think there's quite a bit of nuance into what you're suggesting.
Yeah, hi. I hope my connection is not too hear me well enough.
We can kind of hear you. Go on.
Okay. Okay. So just, I mean, it's the next level of detail since you said that you're working on the indicators, and I don't know how it will show up in terms of tool or question assessments are being done. My experience being in a company, which is SAP, is that normally we reach out to subject matter experts, like, for instance, someone in HR for living wages, right? And my concern is that if you have these new categories, which basically make sense for I think it was called commitment, implementation, performance, right? But if that would be spread very broadly across the questionnaire or the tool, it makes it very difficult to engage with the subject matter experts. And we actually have a huge list of experts and stakeholders that as a sustainability department, we have to work with whenever we review the things. So it will make our lives a lot easier and get the company more engaged around that if you could filter also by topic. For instance, it's not just living wage, it applies to other things. So that was just a proposal I wanted to make.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very, very concrete and very, very useful recommendation. One of the things that is going to change this year is that WBA used to have separate benchmarks, and often companies would get like completely separate kind of communications from the food benchmark and the social benchmark, and so the transaction kind of load was a bit heavy. Now a company will receive like one email from WBA of the assessments, and there will be like the platform, an online platform that we use where the company can go in and fill in their stuff or check what they need to do. I totally, and we have thought of this, how will the company manage this internally? So I think your recommendation of being able to filter by topics is a very useful one, and hopefully the experience will be streamlined. But we might reach out to some companies and trial a pilot of this beforehand, actually, to make sure that this works properly. Thank you.
Thank you.
Perfect. And then we have a last question, unless more come in. which is on the scoring, Alejandro. So Nina is asking if we will continue to have a binary approach for the rating of each sub-indicator. I know we don't have sub-indicators anymore, so you may want to touch upon that. But she basically wants to know if a company partly complies with an indicator, will it be rated 0?
Yeah.
Um,
Thank you. Thank you, Nina. We will not have sub-indicators anymore. We only have indicators. Everything is an indicator, and what we used to call elements in the past, which were, as you say, sub-indicators, will now just be called indicators. We don't have a different level of aggregation. The methodology as proposed has around 100 indicators, and that's it. It's just 100 indicators. We will quite possibly use a combination of binary, so met and met, with what we call maturity scale, which is, for some indicators, as you know, it's difficult or it's kind of not appropriate to just say yes or no. It's like there's shades of gray in between. I'm not gonna go into specific indicators because I actually don't know which are which, but you can imagine on a particular indicator where like the company might be doing some of the stuff that is needed, but not all. And so you might want to grade that. And so we are using this approach now. We will have for some indicators graded or maturity approach rather than this partially met or something between 0 and 1. We can do better than that, and we can be more nuanced when needed. So that's the plan. I don't think it will be for every indicator because some are fairly easy, like you either have it or you don't have it, and that's kind of like easy to check. Some stuff will require a bit more the shades of gray.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Alejandro. I think we did really well on time. Thank you, first of all, everyone, for taking out time for this open session. Really, really appreciate your valuable questions, insights, and like we've shared, please be in touch in case you have more thoughts to share. I think we'd also be remiss if we don't thank Alejandro for he's spearheaded this whole methodology development, along with other colleagues, of course, who couldn't make it to this call. But it's been a busy couple months for them. I also want to thank Rohan for all the prep he's done from the launch webinar to this penultimate one. We have one more open session next Monday, after which we'll officially close the consultation. And then also Nikki, our another colleague who's on the call for her support and guidance throughout. Before we close, I just want to leave you with 2 quick points. The first one is on the process, and the second one is on what comes next. So on the process, we've said this enough, but I want to reiterate it one last time that we will take the feedback we've collected from surveys, one-on-ones, roundtables, events, and sessions like this into consideration. But our final decision will be based on the same principles that Alejandro shared at the beginning. So based on impact orientation, simplicity, alignment with global standards, and so on and so forth. Every piece of feedback will be considered, but not every piece may result in a change. So trust us to share a breakdown of what we did and did not incorporate with reasoning around autumn sometime. Secondly, on what comes next, as we shared, the campaign phase begins soon. We truly believe integration needs to become the expected standard, and not just for WBA, but the world over, in how companies are held to account. So if that is something you believe in too, we would love your support. There are many ways to be part of this campaign, but the simplest one is to directly write to me. Our contact details are on the screen, and I'll make sure you're part of the conversation. Yeah, thank you so much for spending your morning with us, and we'll be in touch with regards to next step.
Thank you, Mansi. Thank you, everybody. Bye.